The wind came before the snow. Everyone in Brennan Ridge knew this, that small mountain settlement, with its pitched roofs and stone chimneys, nestled between two Appalachian ridges, where winters didn't arrive slowly, but suddenly like a fist slamming against shuttered windows. It was November when Sarah Hayes was expelled. There was no ceremony, no shouting or crying at the well in the center square. Only Elder Boone in his worn wool coat, his eyes fixed on the ground, pointing with a crooked finger toward the dirt road leading out of the village. Sarah was 18 years old. In her arms, she carried a bundle of rolled canvas, a few potatoes wrapped in burlap, and the heavy silence of someone who had just lost the only thing she knew. Her mother had died the previous winter consumption, finally claiming what the mountain cold had weakened over years. Her father, before that, a hunting accident when Sarah was 15, his body brought down from the upper ridges on a makeshift litter, still holding the rifle he had carried since the war. All that remained of the Hayes family was barely the house that the neighbors were now claiming for Boone's eldest son, William, who needed a roof over his head for his new bride from the next valley over. The village rules weren't written down, but everyone knew them. Orphans without strong bloodlines had no claim to the land. Sarah was an orphan, and Sarah was a woman. The combination left her with nothing but the clothes she wore and what she could carry. She walked without looking back. The snow hadn't yet settled on the ground, but the air bit her fingers with a preemptive cruelty, that dry cold that smells of ash and frozen pine. Each step crunched on the hardened earth, the sound following her like a ghost of all the footsteps she had ever taken on this road when it had still led home. The road forked 2 leagues from the village. One branch descended into the valley where there were other settlements, other doors she could knock on with empty hands and emptier prospects. The other path led up to the limestone hills that no one frequented anymore, where stray sheep sometimes found refuge beneath rocky slopes and old hunters' trails disappeared into overgrown scrub. Sarah took the path into the hills. The trail was barely a trace of compacted earth among dry brush, visible only to those who sought it with determination or desperation. The wind grew sharper with each bend, and her breath escaped in small white clouds that the air instantly dispersed. She climbed it for almost 2 hours with the bundle pressed against her chest and her toes numb inside her patched boots. It wasn't bravery that drove her upward. It was exhaustion. The valley meant arriving as if by some cruel design at another door, explaining pleading being judged again by faces that would see only what Brennan Ridge had seen: a girl with no family, no dowry, no value beyond what work she could offer in exchange for scraps and pity. The hills, on the other hand, did not judge. The hills only killed or let live. And that November afternoon, that seemed fairer to her than anything Brennan Ridge's men could offer. When she reached the first large overhang, a natural rock platform jutting out from the hillside like a stone lip, she paused to look behind it. The rock was receding, forming a pocket in the limestone face. It wasn't a cave in the strict sense, but a deep hollow, perhaps 12 feet wide and 10 feet long, with a low curved ceiling that reminded her of the root cellars back home. The floor was packed earth covered with dry leaves that the wind had blown in and piled up over years, maybe decades. It smelled of damp earth and cold moss. It didn't smell of death. Sarah entered slowly, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She ducked to avoid hitting her head on the low stone ceiling and felt the walls with her fingers. The rock was cold but dry, the limestone smooth in some places, rough in others. The interior was completely sheltered from the wind, the difference so stark it made her ears ring with the sudden absence of that constant howling. From the outside, the entrance was partially obscured by the overhang itself and by 2 young pine trees growing at an angle on the hillside, their branches forming an imperfect green curtain. Anyone passing below wouldn't notice the hollow unless they knew to look for it, unless they climbed this high with purpose. She sat down on the dry leaves with the bundle in her lap and remained like that for a long time, listening to the wind outside and the silence inside. The difference was remarkable. It wasn't heat, it was the absence of wind, the simple fact of air that stayed still instead of tearing at her skin and clothes. But at that moment, sitting in the growing darkness of that stone hollow, Sarah understood that this difference was precisely the distance between dying and not dying. She ate a raw potato, slowly chewing carefully so as not to waste anything, feeling the starch coat her tongue, and knowing these few vegetables were all that stood between her and starvation. 6 potatoes in total wrapped in the burlap. She'd taken them from the root cellar of her own house 3 days ago when she'd seen William Boone measuring the door frame with proprietary eyes. No one had stopped her. Maybe they'd thought it was fair. Maybe they'd thought she'd be dead before they mattered. Night fell quickly, as it always did in November in the mountains, and the darkness inside the hollow was total. She wrapped herself in the canvas, pressed her back against the rear wall, and drew her knees to her chest. Outside, the wind was picking up the sound of it like distant voices arguing in a language she couldn't understand. Inside, Sarah breathed. And while the first snowflake of the year silently struck the ground of the ledge, she was already thinking. Not about the village that had driven her out, not about the injustice or the fear. She was thinking about what she needed so that Stone Hollow could withstand the entire winter. She had her hands, she had time, and she was hungry enough not to give up. At dawn, the hollow was colder than the night before. Sarah knew it before she even opened her eyes because her breath condensed on the edge of the canvas and fell back onto her face like a fine icy mist. She slowly opened her fingers, flexing them one by one until the pain subsided a little, and then she sat up. The first problem was the wind. During the night, the wind had shifted and was now pushing straight through the opening of the hollow, sweeping away what little warmth had accumulated near the ground. It was a slow but steady wind, not striking, but draining away heat without a sound. Sarah watched it for a few minutes, standing by the opening, her hands tucked under her arms. She needed a wall. She stepped onto the ledge and looked around with a different eye than the day before. Yesterday, she'd been looking for shelter. Today, she was looking for materials. The hillside was covered in loose stones, many of them piled up in small natural cascades on either side of the ledge. The flattest and largest were impossible to carry alone, rocks that would have taken 3 strong men and a mule to move. But there were many medium-sized ones about the size of 2 fists held together that could be moved with sustained effort. She spent the entire morning hauling stones. Her hands were raw within the first hour, the rough limestone scraping skin that had softened over years of indoor work, mending and cooking, and the small tasks that village women did. But she didn't stop. She piled the stones by the mouth of the opening, not to block it completely, which would trap the smoke when she eventually got a fire going, but to build a low partition that would block the wind from the ground without preventing airflow above. She had seen it done with the goat pen back in Brennan Ridge, the way old Thomas had stacked stones to keep the draft off the animal's legs while still letting the air circulate overhead. If it worked for goats, it could work for her. By midday, she had a row of 3 flat stones stacked haphazardly at the base of the opening. But the moment she stepped back to look at her work, the whole thing collapsed, stones tumbling outward and nearly rolling off the ledge. Sarah stood there breathing hard, her hands bleeding from a dozen small cuts. She started again. This time, she dug shallow depressions in the earth, first setting the base stones into them so they wouldn't shift. She selected flatter stones for the bottom row, saving the rounder ones for higher up, where they could wedge against each other. It took until mid-afternoon, and when she was 3 stones up, the wall collapsed again, this time falling inward and scattering the dry leaves she'd been sleeping on. Sarah sat down on the cold ground and closed her eyes. Her father's voice came back to her, a memory from when she was 11 and trying to help him repair the chicken coop. First time you build something, it falls. Second time, it falls different. Third time, maybe it stands. She started again. The third time, she pressed damp mud between the stones, scooping it from under the leaves at the bottom of the hollow where moisture had collected over years of runoff. The mud was almost frozen and difficult to work with, her fingers going numb as she pressed it into the gaps. But as it dried in the spaces between the stones, it created a seal, not waterproof, not permanent, but enough to hold the stack together. She worked until the light was failing, until she had a low wall 3 stones high, running across most of the opening, with a gap on one side where she could pass through. It was fragile. It wouldn't last through many rains, but it would last that week. The wall stood. As darkness fell on her second night in the hollow, Sarah sat with her back against the rear wall and ate another raw potato. The wind still came through the opening, but now it passed overhead, leaving a pocket of relatively still air at ground level where she sat. The difference was small, maybe only a few degrees, but in the cold mathematics of survival, those few degrees were everything. The next task was the ground. The dry leaves covering the earth were somewhat useful, but they flattened under her weight during the night, compressing into almost nothing and losing nearly all their insulating properties. By morning, she could feel the cold of the earth seeping up through the canvas, through her clothes, into her bones. She needed something that would maintain its thickness, that would trap air even under pressure. Sarah went out to look for moss among the more sheltered rocks on the hillside places where the cold hadn't yet arrived in full force. She found quite a bit on the north face of a limestone outcropping about 50 yards from the hollow, thick green moss growing in compact mats still damp from autumn rains. She carefully tore it off in whole blocks whenever possible, her raw hands protesting with each grip, and carried armload after armload back to the hollow. She first spread the leaves in a thick layer along the back wall, then laid the moss on top, compressing it into a band the width of her body, about 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. When she laid down on it that afternoon to test it, the difference was immediate. The moss retained her body heat in a way that the earth alone could not. It wasn't a bed, wasn't anything close to comfort, but it was a barrier between her flesh and the frozen ground. And that barrier was enough to keep her body from expending all its energy, warming itself from below, enough to let her actually sleep instead of just endure the night. Then came the problem of fire. She had kept her father's flint always stored at the bottom of the bundle as if it were a sacred bone. He'd carried it through the war, through 20 years of hunting it in these mountains, and when he died, it had passed to her as naturally as breath. She carefully took it out, wiped it with her sleeve, and surveyed the hollow. The fire couldn't be lit at the bottom far from the opening. The smoke wouldn't escape and would fill the hollow within minutes, choking her. But if she placed it near the opening, just inside the low stone wall, the wind would be blocked at ground level while the smoke could rise and escape overhead. The heat would rise too, warming the interior. She gathered dry twigs from under the pines, loose bark from a fallen trunk higher up the slope, and dead grass stalks curled into compact balls. The first time she struck the flint against the steel striker, the spark didn't catch in the grass. Nor did the second. Her hands were shaking from cold and exhaustion, making it hard to hold the material steady. On the fifth try, a small orange flame appeared among the grass stalks, and Sarah bent over it, shielding it from the wind with her body blowing gently until the smoke became real smoke, until the flame took hold in the bark and spread to the twigs. The fire was small, lasting less than an hour before the wood was consumed, but it was enough to warm 2 potatoes and for Sarah to feel for the first time in 3 days that her body had stopped trembling. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall in earnest fat flakes drifting down through the twilight. Inside, there was light, and although no one in Brennan Ridge knew it, and although no one would celebrate it either, that insignificant flame in the mouth of a rock hollow was the beginning of something that the cold could not extinguish. December arrived without warning and stayed. Unlike the Decembers in the village where people at least had a barn and a fire and neighbors who knocked on the door in the mornings to make sure you'd survive the night, December on the hill was a dense white silence that crushed the entire world under a layer of snow without signs. Sarah learned to measure time by the quality of the light that entered through the opening. White and diffuse meant clouds and a certain temperature, maybe 20 degrees if she was lucky. Bright and cold meant clear skies, merciless sun during the day, and even more intense cold at night when all the heat radiated back up into the darkness. The potatoes ran out by the 3rd week. It wasn't a surprise. She had rationed them from the beginning, eating one every other day, and sometimes stretching it to every 3rd day when her stomach cramped and her thoughts turned sluggish. But there were only 6, and her body craved more than they could provide. The last day, when only one remained, she boiled it in a rusty tin can she had found hanging from a pine tree halfway up the slope, forgotten by some shepherd or hunter long ago. She drank the broth, slowly staring into the fire, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. That night was the worst. The cold wasn't just temperature anymore. It was a weight that began in her bones and slowly rose until it became her thoughts. Sarah wondered with a strange and frightening clarity if she hadn't made a mistake climbing the hill. If the valley, with all its humiliation, all its injustice, wouldn't have been better. At least in the valley there was bread. At least there were human voices. But morning dawned, and with it came something that wasn't exactly hope, but stubbornness. A silent decision that needed no words because there was no one to share it with. She went out at daybreak and walked up the hillside searching. She knew that rabbits in winter followed fixed routes. The same trail sunk in the snow between two bushes, always the same. Her father had taught her this when she was a child in the few seasons she had gone with him to the forest before he fell ill and stopped hunting. Tracks that the trained eye recognized as furrows barely deeper than the surface, a rhythmic depression in the snow that spoke of repeated steps of habit stronger than caution. She found the tracks about 300 yards from the hollow, a clear line running between a stand of juniper bushes and a rocky outcrop. She made a trap with a flexible branch bent into an arch tied to a stake with a strip of cloth torn from the edge of her canvas bundle, the loop placed in the exact center of the trail. It was a simple trap, the kind any country child knew how to make. She didn't know if it would work, but she returned that afternoon and the loop was empty. The next day empty. The third day empty. On the fourth day there was a rabbit. She prepared it without ceremony with cold, quick hands that had gutted chickens and dressed game birds 100 times in her life. As she cooked it over the fire, she noticed that the heat from the small flames wasn't enough to warm the space evenly. The part of the hollow where she slept remained cold too far from the flames to receive more than a memory of warmth. By the time she bedded down for the night, full for the first time in weeks, the fire had died to embers and the cold was already reclaiming the hollow. She began to think about how to move the heat from where it was generated to where it was needed. The idea came from looking at the stones. The stones surrounding the fire after burning for several hours remained hot long after the flames died down. Sarah remembered seeing her mother wrap hot stones in rags to put at the foot of the bed on December nights, remembered the slow release of warmth that could last until dawn. But these weren't small stones that could be wrapped in cloth. These were large, flat stones, heavy enough that moving them would be difficult. But if she could place them strategically in the exact spot where she slept, if she could drag them there before wrapping herself up for the night, they might release their heat slowly over hours. She spent the next afternoon testing the idea, heating the flattest stones she could find by placing them directly in the fire for hours, then using a long stick to push them out and drag them across the hollow floor to the back wall where she slept. The stones were almost too hot to approach, radiating heat in waves. She placed them along the wall of her sleeping area, then quickly spread the moss and canvas over them before wrapping herself up for the night. The heat was released slowly for hours like a silent promise fulfilled at dawn. That night she slept without shivering. It wasn't warmth, not in any real sense. It was barely the threshold between the paralyzing cold that kept her awake and the cold that only bothered her enough to make her curl tighter. But crossing that threshold was everything. The body that didn't expend energy surviving could rest. The resting body could think, and Sarah needed to think. January would come soon, and January in these mountains was worse than anything that had come before. But that night, with the warm stones at her back and the scent of rabbit grease still in the air, Sarah slept soundly. And in her sleep, there was no town, no shame, no hunger. Only a white, silent space that for the first time didn't hurt. January brought with it a week of clear skies that were paradoxically the most dangerous days of winter. Without clouds, the temperature plummeted at night to depths that made the bark of the pine trees crack, with a dry, precise sound like wood splitting in two. The snow on the hillside hardened like glass at dawn. Sarah's breath froze on the edge of the canvas. She wrapped around her face to sleep, forming a stiff rim of ice that scraped her cheeks. But those clear skies also brought something unexpected. During the midday hours, the sun beat down directly on the rocky ledge and the outer face of the stone wall Sarah had built at the mouth of the hollow. That wall absorbed the sun's heat. It wasn't much, not enough to make the stones warm to the touch, but Sarah noticed it one afternoon when she placed her palm against the outer stones before going inside. They were lukewarm, and she realized that this warmth, if it could be channeled and directed inward, methodically, could make a real difference on the longer nights. She spent several days fine-tuning the wall. First, she made it thicker at the base using mud mixed with dry straw she had found on an abandoned slope halfway up the hillside, the remains of some old shepherd's shelter that had collapsed years ago. The straw gave the mud mass. Mass took longer to heat up during the day, but it also took longer to cool down at night. The principle was simple, something she'd learned without knowing she'd learned it, watching the way stone buildings in Brennan Ridge held heat longer than wooden ones. Then she began placing the darkest stones she could find in the top row of the wall, the almost black slate-colored ones, because these absorbed more heat than the lighter limestone. She had seen this without realizing it all her life, the way dark stones along the edge of the village road were always the first to be free of ice on sunny mornings, the way her mother's black iron skillet held heat longer than the tin pans. The combination was slow but real. Midday sun heating dark stone transferring heat to the thick mass below, accumulated warmth that lasted until dawn. It wasn't dramatic, but survival in winter was never about dramatic changes. It was about the accumulation of small advantages. 1 degree here, 1 hour there, until the sum total was the difference between waking up and not waking up. During that same period, while searching for materials on the hillside, she discovered the seep water. It wasn't a spring in any real sense, wasn't a stream or a flow. It was barely a trickle of water oozing between two rocks about 40 yards from the opening on the more sheltered south-facing side of the hill. The water wasn't freezing solid, although everything around it was locked in ice. That meant it was coming from inside the rock, from a depth where the cold didn't reach as fast, where snowmelt from higher elevations was filtering down through limestone fissures. Sarah tasted it with the tip of her lips, careful because bad water could kill as surely as cold. It was clean, mineral sharp, just above freezing. She filled the tin can, then sat down in the snow and cried. It wasn't a long cry, just a brief, unwitnessed moment, her feet wet and numb, her hands wrapped around the can, her throat tight with something that wasn't just the cold nor just relief. It was the weight of 3 months of utter solitude bursting forth unbidden, the accumulated silence of every day and night spent with no voice but her own thoughts. Clean water in winter was life. Unfrozen water was a small, nameless miracle. With the seep secured with a reliable source she could visit every other day without fear of dehydration, Sarah began to think about spring. It was still January and spring was 4 months away, but the mind doesn't wait for permission to plan. Inside the hollow near the bottom where the heat from the stones and her body concentrated during the night, the earth seemed less hard than the frozen ground outside. She pushed a stick down with effort and found that at about 6 inches deep, the earth gave way slightly. It wasn't completely frozen through. She began to store loose soil in the tin can soil she mixed with ashes from the fire and decomposed moss gathered from the dampest parts of the hillside. She didn't know exactly what would grow there, didn't have seeds, didn't have any real plan beyond the vague understanding that come March, she would need to put something in the ground if she wanted to eat next winter. Her mother had always said that where there is ash, there is hope. Ash is the end of the fire, but also what prepares the earth for what is to come. At the end of January, a shepherd from the village crossed the hillside with his dog, following 2 stray sheep that had wandered up from the lower pastures. He looked up when he saw the wisp of smoke rising from the ledge so faint it was almost invisible against the white sky. He stopped. He stared longer than it took to recognize that someone lived there, longer than it took to understand what that meant. Then he continued on his way down to the village, his sheep in tow, his dog trotting behind. That night in Brennan Ridge over supper in the common house, he said he had seen smoke where the banished girl had gone. Some people laughed. Elder Boone, his face thinner than it had been in November, said she must be dead and that the smoke was from something else, a brush fire or a hunter's camp. A younger woman, Martha the woodcutter's wife, said nothing. She just listened, her hands folded on the table, her eyes distant. Sarah knew nothing about it. She was inside the hollow, her hands in the loose earth, preparing what she would plant when March arrived. February began with false promises. 3 days of warming that melted the top layer of snow into slush, filling Sarah with a dangerous optimism that maybe the worst had passed. She ventured farther down the hillside than she had in weeks, checking the rabbit trails, gathering deadwood that had been buried under drifts. The seep water ran faster, almost a genuine trickle now, and she refilled the tin can 3 times in one afternoon just because she could. Then the temperature dropped again, harder than before. The slush refroze into a treacherous crust that could bear no weight, collapsing underfoot and soaking through her boots within minutes. Sarah learned to walk only where the snow had drifted deep enough to form a stable surface, avoiding the deceptive crust that would leave her with wet feet and the very real threat of frostbite. Wet feet in February meant death, plain and simple as arithmetic. The rabbit traps yielded nothing for 5 days straight. She moved them to different locations, tried different configurations, but the animals had either moved to lower elevations or learned to avoid the trails she was watching. By the 6th day, her stomach had stopped cramping and started to feel hollow, a numbness that was worse than hunger, because it meant her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions. She boiled pine needles in the tin can and drank the bitter tea, knowing it had some nutritional value enough to keep scurvy at bay, if nothing else. Her mother had made it during lean times, claiming it had saved more than one family through bad winters. The taste was astringent, resinous, but Sarah drank it twice a day and told herself it was helping. On the 7th day, one trap held a rabbit. She ate half immediately, nearly raw, because she couldn't wait for the fire to properly cook it, and saved the other half for the next day. The meat sat heavy in her shrunken stomach, and she spent the night curled around the warm stones, her body working to digest food it had almost forgotten how to process. The pattern continued through the first week of February. Days would pass with no catch, then suddenly 2 rabbits in 2 days, then nothing again. Sarah lived in a constant state of calculated anxiety, never knowing if this meal was the last one, never able to truly rest, because rest meant lowering her guard, and in the mountains, lowering your guard was the first step toward not getting back up. She refined the hot stone system during this time, learning which stones held heat longest, which ones cracked when heated too quickly, which ones could be stacked in configurations that radiated warmth more efficiently through the night. The flattest slabs went directly against the back wall. Rounder stones went on top, creating air pockets that trapped heat. She wrapped the whole arrangement in moss before covering it with the canvas, building a crude but effective insulation system. The wall at the hollow's entrance had evolved too. What had started as a desperate pile of rocks was now a structured barrier 3 feet high and 4 feet across, with a narrow passage on the left side that could be partially blocked with a flat stone at night. The thermal mass principle was working. On clear days, the dark stones on top would warm in the sun, and that warmth would seep down into the mud and straw matrix, releasing slowly over the course of the night. The hollow was never warm, but it was survivable, and survivable was all that mattered. In the village, things were changing in ways Sarah couldn't see, but that were being discussed in quiet conversations behind closed doors. Martha had mentioned the smoke to her husband, James the woodcutter, asking what he thought it meant. James had shrugged, uncomfortable with the question, with the implication that maybe they'd made a mistake. But Martha pressed. If the girl was alive up there with nothing through this winter, then she knew something they didn't, something worth learning. James had dismissed it at first, but the idea had lodged itself in his mind. A few days later, during a break from splitting wood, he'd climbed halfway up the ridge, ostensibly looking for a dead oak he'd spotted in autumn. He'd seen the hollow from about 100 yards away, seen the stone wall, seen Sarah hauling rocks from one pile to another with methodical purpose. He'd stood there for 10 minutes watching before turning around and going back down. That night over supper, Martha asked if he'd found the oak. James had nodded, then added almost against his will that he'd seen the Hayes girl, that she was building something, that she looked thin but alive, and that the smoke wasn't a brush fire or a hunter's camp. It was a home. Martha had set down her spoon and looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "If that girl survives until spring, you owe her an apology." James had nodded, but they both knew apologies didn't bring back lost months or the house that had been taken. The blizzard came in the second week of February, and no one in Brennan Ridge was prepared. Not because they hadn't had winters before, not because they were foolish or lazy, but because it had been more than 15 years since so much snow had fallen all at once, in such a short time, driven by a wind from the northeast, with a pressure that bent the trees nearly to the ground. In 2 days, the village streets disappeared under accumulation. In 3, the weaker roofs began to groan under relentless white weight. Sarah saw it coming, not the blizzard specifically, but the signs that something massive was building. The air pressure changed, making her ears pop. The wind shifted directions 3 times in one afternoon, unable to settle, as if the mountain itself was bracing for impact. She spent an entire day gathering every piece of burnable wood she could find within safe distance of the hollow, stacking it under the overhang where it would stay dry. She reinforced the wall, wedging small stones into gaps she'd previously ignored, packing mud into every crack with numb fingers that barely responded to her commands. When the storm hit on the third day, it came with a fury that exceeded anything she'd experienced. The wind didn't howl, it roared a sustained bellow that made the stone walls of the hollow vibrate. Snow didn't fall, it was driven horizontally, a white curtain so thick that Sarah couldn't see the pine trees 10 feet away. She retreated deep into the hollow, sealing the entrance gap with a flat stone and praying the wall would hold. It held, but barely. The wind found every weakness, every tiny gap in the stonework, and exploited it. Cold air streamed through in invisible rivers, pooling on the floor and rising slowly to fill the space. Sarah burned wood continuously, more than she wanted to, more than was wise, but there was no choice. The smoke filled the upper portion of the hollow, trapped by the sealed entrance, and she was forced to lie flat on the ground where the air was clearer but colder. She slept in 20-minute intervals, waking each time to feed the fire, to check that the entrance stone hadn't been blown inward, to make sure she was still breathing. The hot stones helped, but their heat was overwhelmed by the cold pressing in from all sides. By the second day of the storm, Sarah had burned through half her wood supply. By the third day, 3/4. She started burning smaller pieces, rationing carefully, but knowing that if the storm lasted more than another day, she would run out. Down in Brennan Ridge, the situation was worse. The first casualty was the Petrak family's barn. The thatched roof, built slowly during a dry summer 5 years ago, couldn't withstand the weight. It caved in with a dull thud in the early hours of the third day, the sound muffled by snow, but loud enough to wake the family in the main house 50 feet away. Robert Petrak ran out in his night clothes, already knowing what he'd find, and stood in the doorway of the collapsed structure, staring at the crushed remains of his grain stores. The sacks of oats that were supposed to last until April, though. Onions hanging from the crossbeam, the dried apples wrapped in straw, all of it buried under splintered wood and wet thatch. Only what was stored in the main house remained, which wasn't much. The Petraks had 5 children, and they'd been counting on that barn. Robert stood there until his wife came out and pulled him back inside his face, blank with the kind of shock that comes from watching a year's work destroyed in seconds. The animals began to die the next day. The cold penetrated the corrals where wooden gates had warped with ice, accumulating on the hinges, gaps forming that let the wind through. 2 pigs belonging to the Dalton family, 3 chickens from the Miller household, and a pregnant goat owned by the Caldwells. The goat's death hit hardest. She'd been due to kid in March, and they'd been counting on the milk, counting on the kids to sell or trade. The eldest Caldwell daughter, 11 years old, found the goat stiff against the wall of the pen at dawn, her eyes still open, frost coating her muzzle. The girl came back into the house without saying a word and didn't speak for the rest of the day. Old Boone died on the 5th day. He had lived alone since his wife died 3 years earlier in a small cabin at the far north end of the village, where the wind was worst and the firewood harder to haul. His son William lived closer to the center, with his new wife in the house that had belonged to the Hayes family. William had checked on his father on day 3 of the storm, bringing bread and making sure the old man had enough wood. Boone had waved him off, insisting he was fine, that he'd lived through worse. William had believed him because it was easier than insisting, easier than forcing his father to leave his home and come stay with them. The neighbors found Boone when the smoke stopped coming from his chimney on day 6. His hands were crossed on his chest, whether by his own doing or by whoever found him first, no one could say. The cold had caught him in his sleep, probably peacefully, probably without pain. But he was still dead, and he was the first. In the village, no one went out unless absolutely necessary. Conversations took place through half-open doors, bundles of wool stuffed into gaps, hushed voices asking if there was bread or firewood to share. Each family's supplies lasted a different amount of time, based on size, based on how much they'd stored, based on luck. The larger families ran out faster, more mouths to feed, more bodies to keep warm. The small children didn't understand why there was no hot food for dinner, and their questions were the hardest to answer. Martha thought about the girl on the hill. She didn't say it aloud, not yet. It wasn't the right time, not with people dying and roofs collapsing and everyone focused on immediate survival. But she thought about it with a clarity that had surprised her. If that girl was still alive up there with less than any of them had from the beginning, then she knew something they didn't. She had learned something in those months of solitude that the village, with all its years and all its traditions, had forgotten or had never known. And if she was dead, well, they'd find out soon enough. But Martha didn't think she was dead. Something about the way James had described seeing her, the purposeful way she'd been moving, the structured way she'd built that wall. That wasn't someone waiting to die. That was someone who'd decided to live. The 6th day dawned clear. The blizzard had ended sometime during the night, the wind dropping away so suddenly that people woke in confusion, their ears still ringing from days of constant noise. The silence that followed was of a different kind than the silence of the wind. It was the silence of exhaustion, of taking stock, of counting what remained and what was irretrievably lost. The accumulated snow was almost 5 feet deep in the highest drifts piled against walls and filling narrow alleys between houses. The main paths had to be dug out by hand, every able-bodied man taking turns with shovels, their breath coming in great white clouds. Up in the hills, Sarah had weathered the storm inside the hollow barely. The cold had been more intense than any previous night, pressing against the stone walls like a living thing trying to get in. The hot stones had helped, but their heat was a candle against a hurricane. She'd burned almost all her wood down to the last few sticks and had spent the final night of the storm wrapped in everything she owned, lying as close to the dying coals as she dared without setting herself on fire. When she finally unsealed the entrance on the morning of day 7, pushing the flat stone aside, she had to dig through a drift that had piled up against the wall. The snow came tumbling in, and for a moment she panicked, thinking she'd be buried. But she pushed through, breaking out onto the ledge, where the sun was shining with a brightness that hurt her eyes after days in smoke-filled dimness. She stood there for a long time, just breathing clean air, feeling the sun on her face. Then she looked down at the valley. The village was a white expanse, barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. No smoke rose from most of the chimneys. Either people had run out of wood or they'd sealed their houses so completely that the smoke was trapped inside. Either way, it wasn't good. Sarah made a broth with the last bones she'd saved from a rabbit 2 weeks ago. Bones she'd been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. She added some roots she'd dried back in October, bitter things she'd dug from the hillside, and boiled it all in the tin can. She drank it slowly, standing by the ledge, looking down at the village that had exiled her. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of vindication or revenge. She felt something heavier and stiller than all of that. She felt the weight of the people who lived down there, people she'd known all her life, people who'd made the choice to send her away. And at that moment, without knowing how or why, they weighed on her shoulders like fresh snow. a burden she hadn't asked for but couldn't seem to put down. The first to arrive were two men. They weren't the strongest in the village nor the youngest. They were the hungriest. They climbed the slope mid-morning on the eighth day, forcing their way through snow that came up to their waists in places, using sticks to probe ahead for hidden rocks, their bare hands red and swollen. They weren't entirely sure what they were looking for, but they were guided by the wisp of smoke that kept rising from the ledge. That stubborn sign in the white sky that said someone up there had fire and fire meant life. When they finally crested the last rise and saw the hollow, they stopped. The stone wall at the entrance, the carefully arranged branches under the overhang, keeping the wood pile dry, the tin can hanging from a stick over a small fire, and Sarah standing by the opening, looking at them without surprise, as if she'd been expecting them, as if she'd known they'd come. No one spoke for a long moment. The two men, Rodek the miller and Jonas the blacksmith, stood there breathing hard, their faces raw from wind and exertion. Sarah stood with her arms crossed, thin but upright, her eyes clear. Rodek finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse from days of breathing cold air. Boone is dead. Sarah nodded slowly. The Petraks lost their barn. Animals are falling. She nodded again. Jonas, younger and less sure of himself than Rodek, looked at the ground. We thought maybe you'd... He didn't finish. Didn't know how to finish. They'd come up here half hoping she was dead so they could feel better about their choices, and half hoping she was alive because they needed what she had. And now she was alive, and they had to live with the fact that they'd exiled a girl who'd proven stronger than most of the men in the village. Sarah let the silence stretch for another moment, then stepped aside. Come in. She sat them down by the fire, gave them what was left of the broth. They drank without looking at her, heads bowed like men who know their pride is buried somewhere deep in the snow and won't be recovered until spring. When they'd finished, when some warmth had returned to their faces, Sarah began to explain. Slowly, without resentment, as if she were describing how to repair a fence or mend a shirt. How to stack a stone wall to block the low wind without losing ventilation above. How to heat flat stones by the fire and drag them to the sleeping place before wrapping up for the night. How compressed moss is better than loose straw because it maintains its thickness under pressure. How the direction of any opening makes the difference between retaining heat and losing everything during the night. How dark stones on top of a wall will absorb more sun than light stones, and how that absorbed heat transferred to a mass of mud and straw below will release slowly over hours. The men listened. Rodek, who'd built mills and understood mechanics, grasped the principles quickly. Jonas, younger but with a blacksmith's intuition for how materials behaved under stress, asked questions about stone placement, about which types held heat longest. Sarah answered everything, her voice steady, matter of fact. This wasn't mercy or forgiveness. It was information delivered without emotion, and somehow that made it more powerful than any angry speech would have been. When they left an hour later, promising to return with others, Sarah stood on the ledge and watched them make their way back down the slope. She wondered if what she'd just done was the right thing, if she should have made them beg, made them apologize. But then she thought about the Caldwell girl who'd found her dead goat, about the Petrak children who'd lost their winter food, and she knew that children shouldn't die for their parents' mistakes. That some knowledge was too important to be held hostage to pride. More came the next day. Martha arrived with her young daughter bundled in her arms, barely visible beneath layers of wool, and her two older sons walking behind carrying shovels to clear the path. Martha brought a piece of hard cheese barely larger than her fist and a sliver of dark bread, the most she could spare from her family's dwindling supplies. She placed them on the flat stone by the entrance without ceremony, without explanation. Then she looked at Sarah directly, woman to woman, and spoke the only words that mattered. Show me the stones. Sarah showed her how to identify the flattest base stones, how to dig shallow depressions to keep them from shifting, how to use mud as mortar and straw as mass. Martha absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone who knew this knowledge would determine whether her children made it to spring. Her daughter, maybe 2 years old, watched from the canvas Sarah laid out for her, too young to understand, but old enough to sense the weight of what was happening. In the days that followed, something changed in Brennan Ridge. There were no speeches, no assemblies called in the common house, no formal acknowledgement of what had happened. Only the conversations people have when the cold forces them to be practical, when pride is no longer enough to keep children warm, and tradition offers no solution to collapsed roofs and empty root cellars. Damaged roofs began to be rebuilt with an intermediate layer of moss beneath the thatch pulled from the north-facing rocks and laid in thick mats just as Sarah had described. The Petrak family's barn couldn't be rebuilt, not in winter, but they reinforced what structures they had left, sealing gaps with mud mixed with ash from their hearths, creating thermal mass where before there had been only thin wood. The corral walls were rebuilt higher and thicker using stones from collapsed walls and old foundations, stacking them the way Sarah had shown the men, low enough to block ground wind, but open enough to let air circulate. The animals that remained thin and nervous gradually stopped trembling in their pens. Most significantly, neighbors began sharing hot stones between houses on the coldest nights. It started with Martha, who heated stones in her own hearth, and then wrapped them in cloth, carrying them next door to the Caldwell family, where the youngest child had developed a cough that rattled in his chest. The warm stones placed beneath his blankets helped him sleep through the night without that terrible shaking that came from a body too cold to properly rest. The practice spread. Stones were passed from doorway to doorway, in the evenings tin cans wrapped in cloth handles, a silent network of shared warmth that required no words because everyone understood what it meant. It meant survival. It meant accepting that one 18-year-old girl exiled and written off as dead had learned something fundamental about winter that they had forgotten. No one spoke Sarah's name in any public gathering. No one wrote it on any notice board or carved it on any memorial stone. But everyone knew where the knowledge had come from, which hollow in the hills had become the source of the wisdom that was keeping them alive. The men who'd climbed up to see her came back with more than instructions. They came back with the story of a girl who'd built a life from nothing, who'd faced the mountain alone and learned its language, who'd been given every reason to let them all freeze and had chosen otherwise. William Boone, Elder Boone's son, heard the stories from his wife, who'd heard them from Martha at the well. He'd been living in the Hayes house since November, sleeping in Sarah's old room, eating at the table where her parents had eaten. The guilt had been manageable when he'd thought she was dead, when he could tell himself it was unfortunate but unavoidable. But knowing she was alive, knowing she'd survived, made the house feel different, made every meal taste like ash. One evening, sitting by the fire his father would never sit beside again, William said to his wife that maybe they'd been wrong. His wife, practical and kind, had nodded and said that maybe was a weak word for what they'd done. They'd taken everything from a girl who'd done nothing to deserve it, and she'd repaid them by saving their lives. That wasn't maybe wrong, that was certainly wrong. William had no response to that, so he'd simply nodded and stared into the flames. The cold persisted through the end of February, but it was no longer the enemy it had been. The village had adapted, had learned, and though they were still hungry and still cold, they were no longer dying. The Caldwell boys' cough improved. The remaining animals grew healthier. The roofs held. And every evening, stones were heated and passed from house to house, a ritual that required no explanation because its necessity was written in every child's face, every parent's relief. March arrived without fanfare, marked only by the subtle lengthening of daylight and the occasional sound of snow sliding off the pine branches in wet, heavy clumps. The transition from February to March wasn't a change in temperature, not yet, but a change in quality. The air lost some of its knife-edge sharpness. The wind, though still cold, no longer felt like it was actively trying to kill everything it touched. Sarah spent the first week of March assessing what the winter had cost her. Her boots were barely held together with strips of cloth wrapped around the soles. Her canvas bundle, which had started as her only blanket, was now riddled with small holes and tears. Her hands were scarred with dozens of cuts that had healed badly, leaving white lines across her palms and the backs of her fingers. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose her hip bones pressing against her skin in a way that made sitting on stone uncomfortable. But she was alive, and more than that, she was stronger. Not physically, though her body had adapted to the constant labor of hauling wood and stones. Stronger in the way a piece of metal becomes stronger when it's heated and hammered, when everything weak has been burned away and what remains is essential, unbreakable. She began preparing the soil for planting, not inside the hollow which she'd briefly considered back in January, before realizing the futility of trying to grow anything in near total darkness. Instead, she focused on a small patch of ground at the southern edge of the ledge, about 6 feet by 4 feet, where the sun hit directly for most of the day. The soil there was thin, barely 3 inches of dirt over limestone bedrock, but it was what she had. She mixed in the ash she'd been saving all winter, working it through the soil with her fingers breaking up clumps, removing stones. The ash would add nutrients, would make the soil less acidic, would give whatever she planted a fighting chance. She added the decomposed moss she'd collected, the organic matter that would help retain moisture once the snow fully melted. It wasn't good soil, not by any measure a farmer would recognize, but it was better than bare rock. The problem was seeds. She had none. The potatoes were long gone, eaten in those desperate early weeks. She had no grain, no vegetables, nothing that could be planted. For several days, she simply worked the soil, preparing it for a future that might never come. The action itself, a kind of faith that spring would bring solutions she couldn't yet see. The solution came from Martha. She climbed up on a clear morning in mid-March alone, this time her sons presumably helping their father with some task in the village. She brought a small cloth bag tied at the top with string and placed it on the stone wall without ceremony. Seeds, turnips mostly, some carrot, peas if you're lucky. Sarah opened the bag, looked inside at the small handful of dried seeds, then looked up at Martha. The older woman's face was weathered, lined with years of mountain winters, but her eyes were direct, honest. Why? Martha shrugged. Because you shared what you knew. Because my children are alive because of it. Because seeds in the ground are better than seeds in a bag. She didn't wait for thanks, just turned and started back down the slope. Sarah stood there, holding the bag, feeling its weight, understanding that this wasn't charity. It was payment, the only currency that mattered up here. Knowledge for seeds, survival for survival. She planted them that afternoon, pressing each seed into the prepared soil with careful fingers, spacing them the way her mother had taught her years ago. Turnips were hardy, could handle cold soil, would be ready by early summer if everything went right. Carrots took longer but stored well. Peas were a gamble this late, but if they took, they'd provide food while everything else was still growing. She marked each row with small stones so she'd know what was where, then covered the whole patch with pine boughs to protect it from any late freezes. It wasn't much. Even if everything grew perfectly, it would barely feed her for a month. But it was a start. It was the difference between surviving one winter and preparing for the next. Down in Brennan Ridge, the conversation about Sarah had evolved from whispered acknowledgments to something more concrete. William Boone, sitting in what he still thought of as the Hayes house, despite living there for 4 months, finally spoke what others had been thinking. He said it to his wife, first testing the words, seeing how they sounded aloud. We should offer her the house back. His wife, Margaret, stopped kneading the bread dough she'd been working and looked at him. You think she'd take it? I don't know, but we should offer. Margaret considered this, her hands still buried in the dough. And if she says no, then at least we offered. At least we tried to make it right. But making it right wasn't simple. The house legally belonged to William, now transferred through village custom after Sarah's exile. Giving it back would require the council's approval, would require acknowledging that the exile had been wrong, that the rules they'd followed for generations maybe needed examining. It would open questions nobody wanted to answer about what else they'd done wrong, who else they'd failed. William brought it up at the next council meeting held in the Common House on a cold evening in late March. The council consisted of 5 men, all older than William, all with deep roots in Brennan Ridge. He presented his case simply: Sarah Hayes had saved lives this winter through her knowledge and generosity. The least they could do was return what they'd taken from her. The response was mixed. 2 council members agreed, immediately influenced by wives who'd been part of the Hot Stone Network, who'd seen firsthand what Sarah's knowledge had meant for their families. Two others were resistant, uncomfortable with the precedent it would set, worried about appearing weak or admitting fault. The fifth, Thomas Caldwell, whose son's life had been saved by those shared warm stones, cast the deciding vote. The girl earned it back. We took her house and she gave us our lives. I call that a fair trade, except we still owe her. The vote passed 3-2. William was authorized to make the offer, but he hesitated, unsure how to approach her, unsure if she'd even want to come down from the hill. Something about the way the men who'd visited her described her standing in the entrance of that hollow, like it was a fortress she'd built with her own hands, made him think she might refuse. Made him think she'd found something up there that the village could never give her. He decided to send Martha instead. If anyone could deliver the message in a way that wouldn't sound like pity or obligation, it was her. Martha agreed, though she warned him that Sarah might not want charity, might not want anything from them at all. William understood that was part of what made the offer necessary. They'd taken from her expecting nothing in return. Now they had to give back expecting the same. Martha made the climb on the last day of March, carrying nothing this time except the message. She found Sarah tending the small garden plot, checking for sprouts that wouldn't appear for another week at least. The two women stood together on the ledge, looking down at the valley where patches of brown earth were starting to show through the melting snow. The council voted. They want to give you back your house. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She kept her eyes on the valley, watching a hawk circle in the distance. It's yours. They made it official. You can move back whenever you want. Sarah finally turned to look at Martha. And if I don't want to move back? Martha smiled slightly. Then you don't. But they wanted you to know, wanted you to have the choice they didn't give you before. What about William and his wife? They'll find somewhere else. There are other houses, other arrangements. That's not your concern. Sarah looked back at the hollow, at the stone wall she'd built, at the moss bedding inside, at the carefully stacked wood pile under the overhang. She thought about the cold nights when that space had been the only thing between her and death, about the lessons she'd learned in solitude, about the person she'd become up here. Then she thought about her mother's kitchen, about the root cellar where she used to store vegetables, about sleeping in a bed instead of on stone. I need to think about it. Martha nodded. Take your time. House isn't going anywhere. She started back down, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you made something important up here. Something worth keeping, even if you go back down. After Martha left, Sarah sat on the ledge for a long time, watching the sun move across the valley. The hollow had been a prison at first, then a refuge, then something else entirely. It had become the place where she'd learned that survival wasn't about strength or luck, but about observation and adaptation, about seeing what the mountain offered and using it, about working with the cold instead of just enduring it. Going back to the village meant comfort, meant human company, meant not having to haul water from a seep or trap rabbits for every meal. But it also meant giving up the independence she'd carved out, the knowledge that she could live entirely on her own terms, that she didn't need anyone's permission or approval to exist. She decided she wouldn't decide yet. Spring was still young. There was time. The first sprouts appeared in early April, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil like small miracles. Sarah checked them every morning, counting them, making sure no animals had disturbed the patch. Turnips came up first, their leaves distinctive, round and slightly fuzzy. Then peas, their shoots thin and delicate. The carrots would take longer, their seeds smaller and slower to germinate. She expanded her food sources as the weather warmed. The rabbit traps still worked, but less frequently as the animals moved back to lower elevations where food was more plentiful. She found early wild greens on south-facing slopes, bitter leaves that needed boiling, but were edible and provided nutrients she'd been missing all winter. She discovered a patch of ramps growing in a sheltered hollow about a quarter-mile from her home, their onion-like smell unmistakable. She harvested them carefully, taking only what she needed, leaving the roots so they'd grow back next year. The seep water flowed stronger, now a genuine trickle, instead of just moisture between rocks. She cleared debris from around it, digging a small basin that would collect water and make filling the tin can easier. It wasn't a spring, would never be a spring, but it was reliable and clean, and that was all she needed. Other people started coming up to see the hollow. Not many, not crowds, but individuals or small groups who were curious about how she'd done it, who wanted to see for themselves the place that had become something of a legend in Brennan Ridge. Sarah tolerated the visitors, showed them the wall, explained the principles behind the hot stones, but she didn't invite anyone to stay long. The hollow was hers, and having people treat it like a curiosity made her uncomfortable. One visitor was different. A young man, maybe 20, who came up in mid-April with a proposal. His name was Daniel, and he was a shepherd responsible for a large flock that grazed the high meadows in summer. He'd heard about Sarah's shelter and wanted to know if she'd be willing to help him build something similar, higher up where he could stay during the grazing season instead of making the long walk back to the village every night. Sarah considered it. The work would take several days, maybe a week. But Daniel offered payment, 2 lambs when they were weaned in June and a share of wool when the sheep were sheared. It was more than fair, more wealth than she'd seen in months. She agreed. They spent 5 days building a smaller version of Sarah's hollow under a rock overhang 2 miles higher up the mountain. Sarah taught Daniel everything she'd learned: how to select stones, how to mix mud and straw, how to orient the opening away from prevailing winds, how to create a sleeping platform that would stay dry even in heavy rain. Daniel was a quick learner, strong and willing to work, and by the end of the 5th day, they had a functional shelter that would keep him safe through the summer months. As they stood looking at the finished work, Daniel turned to her with a question that Sarah realized she'd been waiting for someone to ask. "Why did you help us? After what they did to you, you could have let everyone freeze. Nobody would have blamed you." Sarah thought about the Caldwell boy with his terrible cough, about the Patrak children who'd lost their food stores, about all the people in the village who hadn't personally wronged her, but who'd benefited from her exile simply by not objecting. She thought about what her mother would have said about the difference between justice and revenge. Because children shouldn't die for their parents' mistakes. Because knowledge that only helps one person isn't knowledge worth having. Because the mountain doesn't care about village politics, and neither should survival. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing this. "You're not coming back down, are you, even with the house offer?" Sarah smiled slightly. "The hollow is my home now. That hasn't changed." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. The hollow was home in a way the village house could never be again, but she also knew she couldn't stay isolated forever. The garden would help, the lambs would help, but she'd need other things: salt tools, cloth things she couldn't make or find on the mountain. She'd have to trade with the village, have to maintain some connection, even if she never moved back down. The solution came gradually, organically, without anyone planning it. People started bringing things up to the hollow and leaving them by the stone wall. A new knife appeared one morning, sharp and well-made, with a note saying it was from Jonas Payment for the knowledge about stone selection. A coil of rope appeared a few days later from Radek with no note at all. A wool blanket properly woven and thick left by Martha with a message that her daughter had asked about the girl on the hill, and Martha thought Sarah might need it. Sarah began leaving things in return. Wild herbs she'd gathered tied in bundles and useful for cooking or medicine. A basket she'd woven from willow shoots, crude but functional. Kindling already split and dried, bundled and stacked for whoever might need it. The exchange wasn't formal, wasn't scheduled, but it worked. It was a relationship based on mutual benefit rather than charity or obligation. By late April, the snow was entirely gone from the lower elevations. The village looked brown and muddy, but alive with people working in fields and repairing winter damage. Sarah watched from her ledge, noting who was active, who seemed to be thriving, who was still struggling. She saw William Boone working on someone else's roof, presumably having moved out of the Hayes house as promised. She saw Martha's children playing in the mud outside their home. She saw smoke rising from every chimney life, continuing the winter that had almost killed them, becoming just another story they'd tell. The turnips came in, first pulled from the ground in early May, small but edible. Sarah ate the first one raw, sitting on the ledge, tasting dirt and victory in equal measure. She planted the garden patch again immediately this time, with the few remaining seeds supplemented by wild plants she'd identified as edible. The garden would never be large, would never provide everything she needed, but combined with trapping and foraging, it would be enough. In late May, something unexpected happened. A family from another valley, travelers passing through Brennan Ridge, heard the story of the girl on the hill and made the climb to see her. They weren't looking for knowledge or help. They wanted to tell her that they'd heard the story 2 valleys over, that it was spreading, that people were talking about the girl who'd survived a winter exile and then saved the village that exiled her. Sarah listened to this with mixed feelings. She hadn't wanted fame, hadn't wanted her story turned into legend, but she understood that stories had power, that her survival meant something to people who felt powerless, who'd been told they couldn't survive alone, who'd been made to believe they needed permission to exist. If her story gave them courage, gave them ideas, then maybe the winter had been worth something beyond her own survival. The travelers left, and Sarah returned to her routine, but the visit had planted something in her mind. She thought about other hollow spaces in these mountains, other overhangs and caves that could be turned into shelters. She thought about what would happen if another family was exiled, or if someone needed to leave their village for any reason. Right now, they'd have to learn everything from scratch, make all the same mistakes she'd made. But what if they didn't have to? She started documenting what she knew. Not in writing, she had no paper or ink, but in physical form. She built a second shelter half a mile from her own under a smaller overhang and left detailed examples of how things should be done. The stone wall was carefully constructed, showing the proper technique. A moss bed was laid out and marked. Diagrams made from sticks and stones showed optimal placement of fire pits and sleeping areas. She left a tin can hanging from a branch, a coil of snare wire, a flint and steel wrapped in cloth. It was an emergency cache, a teaching tool and a legacy all at once. If someone needed it, they'd find not just shelter, but instructions, a way to survive, built into the structure itself. She told no one about it, not even Martha, because it wasn't for people who had other options. It was for people like her people who'd been cast out, people who needed to know that someone had survived and wanted them to survive too. June brought the lambs Daniel had promised. 2 young females, healthy and strong, which Sarah penned in a small enclosure she'd built from deadfall and rope. They were real wealth animals she could breed or trade or use for wool and eventually meat. She named them Morning and Evening after the light that bracketed her days, and found herself talking to them in a way she hadn't talked to anyone in months, her voice rusty but functional. The council met again in mid-June, this time with Sarah invited to attend. Martha delivered the invitation, making it clear it was a request, not a summons that Sarah could decline if she wanted. But Sarah was curious. Curious what they wanted, what they thought they could offer her, now that she'd proven she didn't need them. She made the walk down on a warm afternoon, the first time she'd been in the village since November. People stopped what they were doing to watch her pass, not hostile, not friendly, just watching. She'd become something other than what they remembered, something that made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. The council meeting was held in the common house, the same room where decisions about her exile had been made 7 months earlier. The 5 council members sat at a long table, William Boone among them, now having taken his father's seat. Martha was there too, though not on the council, sitting against the wall as a witness. Thomas Caldwell spoke first. "We wanted to thank you formally for what you shared this winter, for saving lives." Sarah nodded but didn't speak, waiting to see where this was going. "We also wanted to propose something. We'd like to make your shelter official, recognize it as village property that you maintain and manage. It would come with a stipend, food and supplies in exchange for keeping it ready for emergencies." Sarah considered this. It was a clever offer. It gave them control while appearing to honor her, turned her survival into a village asset, but it also meant accepting their authority again, accepting that what she'd built belonged to them, because everything in these mountains belonged to someone. "No." The council members exchanged glances. William leaned forward. "We're trying to make things right, to acknowledge what you did. You're trying to take what I built and claim it for the village. The hollow stays mine. I'll share what I know with anyone who needs it, but it doesn't become yours just because you're embarrassed about exiling me." Silence fell over the room. No one had expected direct refusal, had expected gratitude, or at least negotiation. Sarah stood preparing to leave. Thomas Caldwell raised a hand. Wait, you're right. We overstepped. The hollow stays yours, no village claim. But the offer of supplies stands if you're willing to continue teaching people, not as obligation as trade. Sarah paused. That was different. That was honest. I can agree to that, but understand, I'm not coming back to live here. The hollow is home. That's not changing. We understand. We just wanted you to know you have options, that you're welcome here even if you choose not to come. Sarah left the common house and walked back up the hill, aware of eyes following her, aware that something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't a villager anymore, wasn't quite an exile either. She was something new, something they didn't have words for. A woman who'd chosen the mountain over their rules and proven that choice could be survived. As summer deepened, Sarah's routine solidified. She tended the garden, checked the traps, maintained the hollow. She made the walk down to the village once a week to trade, exchanging herbs and advice for flour and salt and other necessities. She spent long afternoons on the ledge, watching weather patterns, learning to read the mountain's moods in ways that would keep her safe through the next winter. Other families began building their own emergency shelters on the surrounding ridges, smaller versions of Sarah's hollow places they could retreat to if another bad winter came. She helped some of them, offered advice to others, watched as the mountain slowly filled with stone walls and fire pits and moss beds. The landscape was changing, adapting, becoming a place where survival was distributed rather than concentrated in one vulnerable village. In late summer, Martha climbed up with her youngest daughter, now old enough to walk the steep path. The girl, 3 years old, stared at everything with wide eyes, fascinated by the hollow, by the lambs, by Sarah herself. Martha let her explore while she and Sarah talked. They're calling it the Girl's Hollow now. Don't know if you knew that. Sarah smiled slightly. I'd heard. That's a name that'll last, the kind that gets passed down that people still say 50 years from now when they've forgotten everything else. I didn't do it for a name. I know, that's why it'll last. Martha's daughter came running back, holding a small stone she'd found, offering it to Sarah like a treasure. Sarah took it solemnly, thanked her, and the girl beamed. In that moment, watching that child who'd been kept alive by knowledge shared freely, Sarah understood that this was the real legacy. Not the hollow itself, not even the techniques she developed, but the proof that survival didn't require permission, that independence and community could coexist, that the rules everyone thought were necessary could be questioned and changed. As autumn approached again, Sarah prepared for another winter. But this time, she wasn't alone in her preparations. All across the ridges, people were applying what she'd taught them, building resilience into their homes and their lives. The mountain was still dangerous. Winter would still be hard. But they'd learned that cold could be understood, that stone could be shelter, that warmth shared was warmth multiplied. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Sarah stood on her ledge and looked down at the village. Smoke rose from every chimney. Light glowed in every window. Inside the hollow wood stacked moss, fresh stones positioned. Ready. And this time not just her.